The wind that morning carried only dust and silence across the New Mexico plains, until Ben Mercer heard it, a sound so faint it could have been a ghost or a prayer. He followed it down to the dry creek behind his ranch, where 3 half-dead foals lay tangled in the mud, their breaths no louder than the whisper of wind. He didn't know it yet, but saving them would awaken more than just life. It would stir the land itself, and every broken heart buried in it. The wind came crawling out of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, dragging the scent of dust and old rain across the high plains of northern New Mexico. It hissed through rows of drying chili peppers strung along the porch and made the rusted windmill moan as it turned. Ben Mercer adjusted his hat against the glare. The sky was a wide sheet of tarnished silver, the kind of sky that pressed down on a man until he could hear his own breathing. Juniper, his mare, walked beside him with her head low, the rhythm of her steps steady as a metronome. Ben trusted that rhythm more than anything left in his life. She'd been his anchor through 3 years of silence since the flood took his son. He didn't talk about that night anymore. He just worked the land, planted where the soil still held moisture, and mended fences that no longer kept anything in or out. That afternoon, the air carried a strange chill. The arroyo behind the ranch, a dry riverbed carved by 100 forgotten storms, was silent. He had come to check the washout, to see if the last rain had torn deeper into the bank. Juniper halted first, ears pricked forward. Somewhere below the wind's steady hiss came a sound thin as a sob. Ben froze. For a heartbeat, he thought it was the wind teasing him. Then it came again. A ragged, broken whimper. He slid down the bank, boots grinding into loose gravel. The smell of clay and sagebrush hit him as he reached the bottom. What he saw there pulled the breath from his chest. 3 small shapes lay huddled together on the cracked bed of the arroyo. Foals, no older than a few weeks, thin as fence rails and caked with mud. Their ribs shuddered with shallow breaths. The one nearest to him was Chestnut, its coat dulled by grime. Another was pale brown, with a gash down one leg. The third, smallest, had a coat the color of storm clouds, and one blue eye, one brown. "Oh, hell," Ben whispered. His voice sounded too loud in the stillness. He shrugged off his jacket and dropped to his knees. Juniper stood above on the rim, ears twitching, tail lashing the dust. He pressed his palm to the chestnut foal's neck. It was hot, slick with sweat. "Easy, kid," he murmured. The second foal stirred weakly, a tremor running the length of its body. The little gray didn't move at all. Ben looked up toward Juniper. The mare stamped once, as if urging him on. He fetched the canteen from his belt, poured water into his hand, and trickled it across the gray foal's muzzle. A flicker, a twitch of its ear, then the faintest lick of its tongue. "Come on," he whispered. "Stay with me." He worked for minutes that felt like hours. The chestnut one drank greedily, coughing halfway through. The pale brown licked his palm and tried to nuzzle closer. The gray simply breathed, slow and uneven. Above them, Juniper blew softly through her nostrils, watching with the patience of something that had seen this before. When the canteen ran dry, Ben tore off his flannel shirt and wrapped the foals together, pulling them close to share what warmth he had left. The sun slid lower, smearing the horizon with rust and violet. The cold crept up fast from the ground. "Don't you die on me now," he muttered. "Not here." He studied the shallow cuts on their legs, marks from rope, maybe wire. Whoever had left them here hadn't just abandoned them. They'd made sure the desert would finish what cruelty began. He felt the old anger stir in his gut, the same useless anger that had haunted him since the flood. It burned for a moment, then collapsed into something quieter: determination. He climbed the bank, grabbed the old wool blanket from Juniper's saddle, and carried it down again. "We'll get you home," he said. The words sounded strange after months of talking only to the wind. One by one, he lifted the foals. The chestnut was the heaviest. He grunted as he carried it up to the mare. The pale brown came next, trembling in his arms like a bird. When he reached for the gray, its head lolled against his chest, heart fluttering like a trapped sparrow. Ben pressed his forehead to its damp mane. "You're not going anywhere tonight." Juniper waited while he arranged the foals across her broad back, layering the blanket over them. The sky had turned cobalt. A single star blinked above the ridge. Ben gathered the reins, gave Juniper's neck a reassuring pat, and started the slow walk back to the ranch. The mare's hooves thudded softly against the dirt road. Behind them, the arroyo lay quiet again. Nothing left but the whisper of wind through dry reeds. The night smelt of cold clay and distant smoke. By the time they reached the yard, the temperature had dropped enough for frost to form on the fence rails. Ben pushed open the barn door with his shoulder. The old hinges groaned. Inside, dust hung in the air like breath made visible. He laid the foals down on a patch of straw, pulling his coat around them. Juniper stood watch, her eyes reflecting the lamplight. The chestnut twitched, the pale brown sighed, and the gray gave a thin, raspy whinny, barely a sound, but enough. Ben sank onto a bale of hay, elbows on his knees, staring at the fragile bodies. For a long while, he listened. To the faint wheeze of their lungs, to Juniper's slow breathing, to the wind seeping through the cracks in the barn wall. Then he whispered, "All right, you made it this far." He reached out and ran his hand once more down the gray foal's neck. Little creature's heart thudded steady under his palm. For the first time in years, Ben felt something move inside him that wasn't grief. Outside, the wind changed direction. It carried with it the scent of rain that never quite arrived. "Tomorrow," he said to no one in particular, "we'll figure the rest out." He turned down the lantern, its light softening to amber. In that half-dark, Juniper lowered her head beside him. Her warm breath touched his arm. Together, they watched over the foals while the night settled, and for the first time in a long time, Ben Mercer didn't feel entirely alone. The morning came thin and brittle, the kind of dawn that cracked open with frost instead of light. The horizon glowed faintly pink over the mesas, and the first breath of sun crawled through the slats of Ben's barn. He had slept sitting up on a hay bale, his hat tipped over his eyes, every muscle aching. When he stirred, 3 small chests rose and fell beneath the wool blanket beside him. They were alive. That was all that mattered. Juniper shifted in her stall, the sound of her hoof scraping against the dirt steady and patient. Ben poured a handful of grain into her trough, listening to the soft rhythm of her chewing. "You earned it," he murmured. She flicked her tail, warm breath fogging the chill air. He crouched again beside the foals. The chestnut's eyelids fluttered as it dreamed, its nostrils twitching at the scent of straw. The pale brown one lay still, exhaustion pressing it flat, but the wound along its leg had stopped bleeding. The little gray opened one mismatched eye, one blue, one brown, and fixed on him. Ben froze. The foal blinked once, twice, then closed its eyes again, as if to say, "I'm still here." That look stayed with him as he carried water from the pump. He filled a dented pot, heated it on the stove, and soaked an old towel until it steamed. When he returned, Juniper turned her head toward the door, nostrils flaring. She always knew before he did when something fragile needed gentleness. Ben knelt, wringing the towel and wiping the dust from their hides. The smell of wet earth rose into the air, clean and heavy, filling the small space like a benediction. For the first time since his boy's accident, Ben spoke out loud. Not to Juniper, not to anyone in particular, but to the stillness itself. "You ever wonder if some things come back just to make us remember?" His voice cracked like dry timber. The barn didn't answer, but Juniper blew a long breath, the sound deep and low, as if agreeing in her own language. Outside, the world was waking up. A coyote barked somewhere beyond the ridge. The neighbor's dog replied. A flock of sandhill cranes drifted south, their calls threading through the cold air. Ben opened the barn doors to let in the sun. The light touched the foals like a blessing. Steam rose from their damp coats, curling toward the rafters. He brewed coffee strong enough to taste like burnt hope and drank it, standing in the doorway. The horizon shimmered gold, endless and empty. The land hadn't forgiven him yet, but at least it hadn't taken anything more. Not last night. He looked toward the small house beyond the fence, its adobe walls cracked with time. In the window hung a faded photo of his son, arms wrapped around a toy horse. Ben turned away. The ache had dulled over the years, but never disappeared. It simply found quieter corners to hide in. Now, staring at those 3 foals, he felt the same fierce helplessness that had nearly drowned him years ago. But this time, he refused to give it the last word. When the chestnut stirred and tried to rise, Ben crouched beside it, one steady hand on its flank. "Easy," he whispered. "There's no race here." The foal trembled, then collapsed again into the straw. Juniper snorted softly from the stall, watching every move. He named them without thinking. The red one, Ember, because fire lived under his skin. The pale brown, Fern, delicate but stubborn. And the little gray, Echo, because that's what the world felt like when you lost everything. The sound coming back after you'd already stopped speaking. The names felt right. They gave shape to something he hadn't had the courage to believe in for a long time. Possibility. He wrote them on the back of an old feed bag with a carpenter's pencil and tacked it above the stall. Names, he thought, meant responsibility. You couldn't walk away from what you'd named. As the day slipped toward noon, Ben carried the smallest foal, Echo, to the patch of light that spilled through the barn door. The colt blinked and lifted its head, inhaling the dry scent of sage carried on the breeze. Juniper stepped forward, lowering her muzzle until it brushed against the colt's neck. The sound that left her throat was so soft, it was almost a hum. Ben felt something inside him unclench. He didn't cry. He couldn't. The tears had long since turned to salt somewhere deep, where no one could see. But his breath hitched once as he whispered, "You'll be all right." He spent the afternoon repairing an old corral behind the barn. Every nail driven into new wood echoed with purpose. Between hammer strikes, he heard juniper nickering, the foals rustling in the straw. The sounds folded into the day's rhythm, the kind of rhythm that steadies a man more than prayer ever could. As the sun began to sink, the air turned copper. He carried the last bucket of water inside and knelt beside them again. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we'll see if you can stand." Juniper moved closer, the leather reins brushing against his shoulder. He reached up and rested a hand on her neck. "We'll need help, old girl. You and me. We can't do this alone." The mare blinked slowly, as if she already knew who would come. Outside, the first star appeared above the mesa. Ben looked at it and thought of the long road to Santa Fe, of the vet whose number he still kept on a scrap of paper. He whispered into the fading light, "All right. Tomorrow, we'll call her." Juniper's tail swished, and somewhere in the barn, the foals stirred. 3 faint breaths rising and falling like a fragile promise. The wind had calmed for the night, leaving only the faint murmur of water from the pump. Steady, patient, alive. By the next morning, the thin frost that had silvered the fence rails was already melting. The wind carried a warmth that promised a short reprieve before winter truly set its teeth into the valley. Ben stood by the pump, washing the dust from his hands, when he heard the distant grind of an engine. It wasn't the sound of a ranch truck, too smooth, too well kept. He wiped his palms on his jeans and squinted toward the road. A white pickup turned off the highway and rolled slowly down the dirt lane, kicking up soft clouds of ochre dust. The logo on the side door read, "Dr. Naomi Lee, DVM, Santa Fe Equine Care." Ben's stomach tightened. He had called her at dawn, half hoping the line would ring unanswered. The truck came to a stop beside the barn. A woman stepped out, her dark hair pulled back beneath a faded ball cap, her jacket dusted with road grit. She moved with the practiced economy of someone used to being alone on back roads. "Mr. Mercer?" she asked. Her voice carried the slight cadence of someone who'd lived between languages and learned how to make silence do the rest. "That's me," Ben said, pushing his hat back. "Appreciate you coming." "I was already heading north," she replied, "and your message said it was urgent." She didn't wait for more. "Show me." Inside the barn, the smell of straw and damp hide mingled with the faint tang of iodine from the bottle Ben had found in an old tack box. Naomi knelt immediately beside the blanket, her movements brisk but gentle. Juniper raised her head from the stall, watching closely. The vet spoke softly as she examined each foal. "Dehydrated," she murmured. "They've been without their dam for days. Rope burns here, infection starting, but the lungs sound stronger than I expected." She looked up at Ben. "What did you feed them?" "Warm milk, powdered. It's what I had for calves." "That explains why they're still breathing," she said, half smiling. She reached for her bag, unrolling a line of sterile gauze and syringes. "We'll give fluids, antibiotics. I'll need to take samples if that's all right." "Do what you need." She worked in silence, the kind that filled a room without suffocating it. When she pressed the needle into the chestnut's neck, the foal jerked. Ben moved instinctively, steadying its head, murmuring low. Naomi watched the exchange, his rough hands, his gentleness. "You've done good work, Mr. Mercer," she said quietly. He shrugged. "Just couldn't walk away." She didn't answer, but her eyes softened. After a while, she stood, stretching her back. They'll need warmth tonight. Keep them on dry bedding, feed every 2 hours. I can do that. As she packed her instruments, she looked toward Juniper. That's a good mare you've got. Best there ever was, Ben replied. Juniper gave a slow blink, as if acknowledging the compliment. When Naomi stepped outside, the wind lifted her cap brim. She scanned the horizon, the expanse of dun-colored fields, the faint shimmer of heat still rising from the arroyo. This place, she said, almost to herself. It's beautiful in the way a scar can be. Ben followed her gaze. It's been through plenty. I can tell. She hesitated, then added, if they survive, you should file a report. Abandoning livestock is a felony. Someone left them to die. Ben's jaw tightened. Let's get them through tonight first. Naomi studied him a moment, then nodded. I'll check back tomorrow. You have my number if anything changes. She handed him a small card, the paper creased from use. Her thumbprint smudged the ink. When she drove away, the sound of her tires faded into the wide hush of afternoon. Ben stood there, card in hand, until the dust settled back to earth. Then he returned to the barn. Inside, Juniper was standing guard, head low over the foals. The light fell in bands across the straw, illuminating each fragile rise and fall of their breathing. Ben sat beside them again, exhaustion creeping through his bones. He thought of Naomi's words. Someone left them to die. He tried to picture who could do such a thing, but all he saw was the emptiness of the land itself, indifferent and ancient. He stayed there until the light turned amber. The foals shifted slightly, stirring against the warmth of the blanket. Juniper flicked her tail, the sound whispering through the still air like the turn of a page. Ben reached for the gray colt, stroking its neck where the pulse beat strong now, steadier than the day before. You've got a doctor looking out for you now, he murmured. Not just an old fool and his horse. The colt's ear twitched toward his voice. A small gesture, but enough to make him breathe easier. He rose and stepped outside. The sun was sinking behind the mesa, throwing long shadows across the fields. The horizon glowed like a line of fire. For the first time in years, Ben felt something other than the heavy quiet of routine. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope was too fragile a word. It was more like the memory of it, echoing through him the way sound lingers in a canyon long after it's gone. He leaned on the fence, watching the wind pick up again, brushing the tall grass in waves. Somewhere far off, a raven called, its cry sharp against the fading light. Ben looked toward the road Naomi had taken, then back at the barn, where the faint lamplight glimmered through the cracks. Guess we're not done yet, he said under his breath. Juniper answered with a low nicker from inside, and Ben smiled despite himself. Night fell gently, laying its cool hand over the valley. The stars came out one by one, reflected faintly in the water trough. In the barn, 3 small bodies slept beneath a blanket that smelled of dust, milk, and second chances. And for the first time since the flood, the ranch felt almost alive again. By the time the second sunrise burned over the ridge, the ranch had begun to smell like life again. Warm hay, damp leather, the faint sweetness of milk powder. Ben was outside stacking bales when he heard the creak of wagon wheels on gravel. He straightened, shading his eyes. The silhouette coming down the lane was familiar. Broad-shouldered, hat brim pulled low, an old sorrel horse plodding beside a rickety cart. "Morning, Mercer," the old man called. "Heard you've been collecting strays again." "Morning, Tomas," Ben said. "You must have been listening to the wind. It talks too much around here." The Navajo rancher chuckled, the sound rough as the land itself. His silver hair caught the sun like wire. "The wind doesn't lie. Folks said they saw the vet's truck. I figured I'd come see what sort of trouble you invited this time." Ben motioned toward the barn. "Come on, then. Might as well meet them." Inside, the air held a quiet warmth. Juniper flicked her tail in greeting, but didn't move from her watch near the foals. The chestnut, Ember, was already standing for short stretches, shaky but determined. Fern, the pale one, dozed with her nose pressed into the straw. Echo, the smallest, lifted his head and blinked when the two men entered, one blue eye catching the light. Tomas removed his hat, kneeling beside the stall. "Ah," he breathed, his voice soft. "Ghost Run blood." Ben frowned. "Ghost what?" The old man's gaze stayed on the gray foal. "A legend from before fences, long before your family settled here. They say a herd of mustangs once ran through these valleys, horses that could smell rain before clouds formed. They knew where water hid under rock, could find it when every riverbed was dust. People called them the Ghost Run because they came with the storms and vanished when the land was healed." He looked up, eyes bright. "That one, the gray. Look at those eyes. One for the sky, one for the earth. It's a sign. The Ghost Run's blood still breathes." Ben rubbed the back of his neck. "You really believe that?" Tomas smiled. "Belief's just another kind of memory, friend. Sometimes it's all that keeps the wind moving." Juniper gave a soft rumble in her throat, almost as if answering him. For a moment, silence filled the barn, thick, alive, full of unseen things. Ben felt the hair rise on his arms. "Well," he said finally, forcing a small laugh, "whether he's ghost or flesh, he's got to eat like the rest of us." Tomas nodded approvingly. "You'll do right by them. The land gives second chances to those who don't turn away." They stepped outside. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of rain, though the sky stayed stubbornly clear. Tomas squinted toward the arroyo, where the foals had been found. "The earth remembers," he said, "even when men forget. That arroyo used to carry spring water. Then the upstream ranchers dammed it off. The bones of the Ghost Run still lie beneath that sand." Ben followed his gaze. The dry channel wound through the plain like a scar. "You think that's where their herd came from?" "I think the herd led them back here," Tomas said. "This place owes them water. Maybe they came to collect." Ben didn't answer. He could still feel the roughness of the foal's skin under his hands, the way their hearts had fluttered against his palms. Maybe there was truth buried in the story. Maybe not. But he'd learned that the line between myth and mercy wasn't as wide as it looked. They spent the rest of the morning repairing the corral fence. Tomas worked slow but steady, humming an old tune in Navajo that sounded like the rhythm of hoofbeats. When they stopped for coffee, he leaned against the post and studied Ben. "You've been quiet since the flood," he said. "Too quiet. It's good to hear nails hitting wood again." Ben's jaw tightened. "Quiet keeps things from breaking. Or keeps them from healing," Tomas said. "Sometimes you got to let noise back in." Before Ben could reply, Juniper neighed sharply from the barn. Both men turned. The call wasn't panic. It was insistence. Ben broke into a run. Inside, the foals were restless, stamping at the straw. The air felt charged, almost humming. Outside the open door, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the valley, though the sky showed no clouds. "Storm's talking early," Tomas said. Ben knelt beside Echo. The gray colt's ears flicked, head tilting toward the sound. The air smelled faintly of ozone. He could feel the vibration through the floorboards, like the earth itself breathing. "They're hearing something," Ben said quietly. Tomas nodded. "They always do. Horses know what we don't." The thunder faded as quickly as it had come. The barn fell silent again, the only sound Juniper's steady breathing. Echo lowered his head and nuzzled Ben's sleeve. A strange calm settled over the moment, as if the world had just whispered a secret meant only for them. Tomas exhaled, long and low. "Mark my words, Mercer. When the rain finally comes, it'll be because of them." Ben looked at the foals, then at the sky through the open door. The sun broke free again, flooding the barn in light. He didn't say he believed it, but he didn't say he didn't either. When Tomas left that afternoon, his wagon wheels creaked down the road until the sound melted into the wind. Ben stood at the gate, watching the trail of dust drift away, then turned back toward the barn. Inside, Juniper had lain down beside the foals, her great body forming a shelter around them. Ben leaned on the doorframe, feeling the ache in his chest loosen a little. The wind carried a hint of sage and something else, something wetter, more alive. Maybe rain, maybe memory. He whispered to no one. "Ghost run, huh? Guess we'll see." The mare flicked an ear, and the faintest rumble of distant thunder answered, rolling soft and low through the hills. The third dawn found the valley half-veiled in mist. It wasn't real fog. New Mexico rarely offered that gift, but a low, ghostly haze rising from the cold ground as the sun pressed up from behind the ridges. Ben stood at the barn door, coffee steaming in his hand, feeling the kind of quiet that wasn't absence, but balance. The land was breathing again, slow and even. Inside, the world smelled of straw, milk, and animal warmth. Ember was on his feet, narrow legs trembling but proud, the first streak of life moving with will instead of instinct. Fern lifted her head at his motion, still too weak to stand but watching, her big eyes glossy with reflection from the lantern's glow. Echo lay in the patch of light near Juniper's forelegs, one blue eye open, the other half hidden beneath a forelock that shimmered silver in the dawn. "Morning, kids," Ben said softly, setting down the cup. His voice had begun to find rhythm again, a little rough, but no longer foreign to his own ears. He filled the bottles Naomi had left. Measured powder, hot water, a careful shake until foam rose at the top. Juniper shifted to the side to give him room, snorting as the scent of milk thickened the air. Ben knelt first by Ember. "You're the brave one, huh?" The colt nosed the bottle, hungry and impatient. Milk dribbled down his chin as he drank. Fern was harder. She turned her head away at first, eyes wide, trembling at the sound of the cork squeaking against the glass. Ben didn't push. He just sat cross-legged on the straw, holding the bottle where she could smell it. Juniper lowered her head until her breath ruffled Fern's mane. That seemed to calm her. After a moment, she inched closer, nostrils flaring. "Easy now," Ben whispered. "Nobody's gonna hurt you." When she finally took the bottle, it was only for a heartbeat. 2 gulps, a pause, another sip. It was enough. Ben's throat tightened with something that felt too close to grace. "That's it, girl. Good." Echo watched everything without moving. His mismatched eyes tracked the light, the bottles, Juniper's steady rhythm. Ben tried offering him milk, but the gray colt only flicked an ear. Too weak or too wary. Ben sighed, sitting back on his heels. "You'll come around when you're ready." He didn't notice he'd started talking more, filling the silence with small sentences, half to them, half to the ghosts that used to haunt the rafters. The barn seemed to listen. By midday, Ember had made it 3 steps before collapsing again, and Juniper had taken it upon herself to guard every attempt like a sentry. Fern slept in the straw's warmth, her breaths shallow but steady. Echo dozed too, twitching now and then, his hooves kicking faintly as if dreaming of running. Ben spent the afternoon fixing the roof above the stalls. The wind sang through the boards, pushing a dry sweetness through the cracks. When he stopped for water, he noticed Juniper watching him from below, ears forward, the faintest question in her gaze. He grinned. "Don't worry, old girl. I'm not going anywhere." As he came down, thunder muttered far to the west. A sheet of clouds moved slow as smoke above the horizon. The air thickened with the metallic scent of change. The ghost run, he thought, remembering Tomas's story. Rain before the clouds. Near sunset, he led Juniper out to stretch her legs. The light turned the land copper and violet. From the hill above the arroyo, he could see the dry scars of the creek twisting through the plain. He thought about the foals lying there 2 nights ago, about how close silence had come to winning. The thought made him reach unconsciously for Juniper's mane, grounding himself in the heat of her neck. When they returned, the barn felt warmer than usual. The last of the sunlight slanted through the boards, catching particles of dust and turning them into drifting sparks. Ben crouched near Echo again, holding the bottle out. "All right, little one. 3rd time's the charm." The colt didn't move for a moment. Then, as if deciding, he lifted his head, nostrils quivering. His muzzle brushed Ben's wrist. A single sip, hesitant, then another, stronger. The rhythm steadied. Ben froze, hardly daring to breathe. "That's it," he whispered. "You found it." Echo's ears flicked at the sound of his voice. For a few seconds they simply stayed like that, the man holding, the foal drinking, Juniper standing over them both with her eyes half closed in peace. Outside, thunder rolled again, closer this time. Ben laughed under his breath. "Guess we're all learning how to breathe again." The light dimmed. The first drops of rain tapped on the roof, soft and rare. Juniper turned toward the sound, her tail swishing slow, and Ember gave a small, uncertain whinny. The smell of wet dust crept through the cracks, earth remembering itself. Ben sat back, soaked in the rhythm of rain and breathing. Each sound was fragile but real. The patter on tin, the gentle hiss of straw, the faint snort of horses settling for the night. He thought of Tomas's words. When the rain comes, it'll be because of them. He looked at the 3 foals, alive where death had left its shadow, and he realized that maybe it didn't matter whether the ghost run was real. The miracle was already here, lying in the straw before him. When he finally stood to leave, the barn light glowed like amber through the mist. Juniper lifted her head, watching him with the same quiet knowing she'd carried since the first day they met. Ben touched her muzzle, smiling. "You keep watch, all right? You're better at it than I am." He stepped into the rain, hat pulled low. The air was cool and alive, washing the dust from his skin. Behind him, through the half-open door, came the faintest sound, a soft, broken whicker from the gray colt, a voice testing itself against the world. Ben stopped, listening. The rain paused between breaths. "That's it, Echo," he murmured. "You tell it you're here." He didn't turn back. He just stood there until the sound faded into the steady rhythm of the storm, until the night and the land and every heartbeat seemed to breathe as one. The rain that had touched the land the night before didn't stay long enough to soak it, but it left a scent, the deep, almost holy smell of wet dust. It lingered in the morning air as Ben stepped out of the barn, rolling his shoulders after a sleepless night. His shirt stuck to his back, and his arms were streaked with straw and dried milk. He didn't mind. Inside, 3 small lives were still breathing. That was enough. He was halfway through checking the water trough when a pickup approached, engine rumbling across the flat. For a moment, his chest tightened. He hadn't expected company. The truck stopped by the gate, and a woman climbed out, a tall figure in a khaki jacket with a sheriff's badge gleaming in the light. "Ben Mercer?" she called. He nodded, squinting. "That's me. I'm Sheriff Rosa Delgado. Got a call from Dr. Lee. She said you found some foals out here." Ben wiped his hands on his jeans. "They're in the barn. Come on." Inside, Rosa paused to take in the scene. The mare standing sentinel, the 3 foals huddled in their straw nest, the man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Her eyes softened. "You've been busy." "Did what I could," Ben said. "Dr. Lee's been helping." "She's good people," Rosa replied, kneeling to inspect the marks on Ember's legs. "These weren't from barbed wire. Someone tied them up." "I figured as much. You planning to report it?" Ben hesitated. He'd never been a man who sought lawmen's help, and Rosa's presence stirred old instincts to keep quiet. "Let's get them strong first," he said finally. Rosa studied him for a beat, then nodded. "All right, but if someone dumped them here, they'll likely come looking to finish what they started. Then they'll find me waiting." Her eyes flickered with something between respect and concern. "Just be careful, Mercer. People who treat animals like this don't think twice about treating humans worse." He didn't answer. Juniper shifted behind them, the scrape of her hoof echoing through the barn. Rosa glanced at the mare and smiled. "She's beautiful. Quarter horse?" "Half Mustang," Ben said. "Smart enough for both." The sheriff chuckled. "I'll swing by in a few days to check on things. And, Ben, thank you. Not many would have stopped to listen to a cry out there." After she left, the silence felt different. Not heavy, but connected. The world knew now. The story was no longer his alone. By mid-morning, another visitor came rattling down the road. This time it was an old farm truck with the logo of the Chimayo Feed and Supply Store. A young man jumped out, waving. "Mr. Mercer, I brought what Dr. Lee ordered. Hay cubes, formula, antibiotics. She said you'd need help." Ben blinked. "You drove all the way from town for that?" The boy shrugged. "Doc paid for the gas. Said you'd try to turn her down if she told you." Ben laughed quietly. "She knows me too well already." The boy helped unload the feed, his face bright with curiosity. "You really found them in a dry creek?" "Yeah." "Man," the kid said, shaking his head. "Stuff like that makes people listen. My cousin's got a podcast, Heartland Rescue Stories. Maybe he'd—" Ben cut him off with a raised brow, but not unkindly. "Let's just keep them breathing first, son." "Right," the boy said, flushing. "Sorry." When the truck left, Ben leaned against the fence, watching the dust trail fade. He wasn't sure how he felt about word spreading, but a part of him, small, stubborn, didn't mind. Maybe the world needed to remember that compassion could start in a place like this. Later that afternoon, Naomi returned, parking beside Juniper's paddock. She carried a cooler and a tired smile. "I brought plasma for the smallest one," she said. "Echo's strong enough to fight, but he needs help." Ben nodded toward the stall. "He's stubborn. Reminds me of someone I used to know." They worked in tandem, the routine now seamless. Naomi checking vitals, Ben steadying each foal while Juniper stood close, breathing her calm into the air. When the infusion finished, Naomi leaned back on her heels. "You're good at this," she said. "You ever think of working with horses full-time?" "I already do," he said simply. She smiled. "Fair point." Then more softly, "Your place feels different today." Ben looked around. The sunlight slanted through the boards, catching motes of dust like glitter. Maybe the land's remembering how to be alive again. Naomi didn't reply. She just watched him a moment longer, then rose to leave. "Call me if there's any change. And Ben, try to get some rest. The foals aren't the only ones who need saving." When she was gone, Ben sat by the open door, listening to the hum of late afternoon. The valley stretched before him, shimmering with heat. He thought about Rosa's warning, about Naomi's quiet kindness, about Tomas and his stories of the ghost run. Somehow, all those threads were weaving into something he couldn't quite name. As the sun began to dip, Juniper snorted and nudged him toward the stall. Inside, Ember was testing his legs again, wobbling like a drunk on ice. Fern blinked sleepily, her coat already starting to shine beneath the dirt. Echo lay still, but his breathing was steady. Slow, strong, defiant. Ben crouched down beside them, resting his elbows on his knees. "You hear that, boys and girls?" he murmured. "You've got half the county watching out for you now." Juniper lowered her head beside his, her breath stirring the hair at his temple. Together they watched the foals settle into quiet. The last light spilled across the straw, turning everything to gold. From far away, a bell rang from the church in town. Its echo drifted through the valley, mixing with the rustle of wind and the faint creak of wood. Ben thought of how silence had ruled this place for too long, and how it was finally being broken not by sorrow, but by the sound of people caring. He leaned back against the stall, exhaustion pulling at him. But it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from doing something worth the ache. As dusk deepened, he whispered to the mare, "Looks like we're not alone anymore, Juniper." She flicked an ear and sighed. The foals breathed in unison, 3 small rhythms steady against the heartbeat of the land. And for the first time since the flood, Ben Mercer let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, the wind had carried something back to him that he hadn't known he was missing. The rain clouds that had wandered through the valley 2 days before had vanished as quickly as they came, leaving behind a pale, hard sky. By late morning, the ground had crusted again, the air dry enough to chap a man's lips between words. Ben leaned on his shovel at the edge of the field, watching the thin shimmer of heat crawl across the horizon. He could hear the faint rattle of the acequia, a narrow ditch that once carried snowmelt through the ranch lands. But even from here, the sound was wrong. Hollow. He walked toward the waterline, Juniper following with slow, curious steps. When he reached the ditch, what greeted him was nothing but a cracked vein of mud. The last thread of flow had disappeared overnight. He knelt and pressed a finger into the soil. It was bone dry, warm as skin. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. The drought had been creeping in all year, but this was different. Someone had shut the upstream gate, diverting what little water there was to the industrial site south of town, South Line Aggregates. He'd heard their name plenty over the past month. They wanted to dig a quarry just beyond the ridge, promised jobs, money, and progress. The same promises that had hollowed out other valleys before. Juniper stamped a hoof, uneasy. Ben looked up, the wind tugging at his hat brim. "Yeah," he said softly. "I feel it too." Back at the barn, the foals were restless. Ember pawed the straw, already itching for space. Fern trembled every time a truck groaned down the distant road. Echo lay quiet, his mismatched eyes following the dust motes that drifted through the beams of light. Ben refilled the trough with what he could spare, the sound of water hitting metal sharp against the hush. By midday, Naomi's truck rolled up the drive, tires crunching against gravel. She stepped out with a clipboard tucked under one arm. "You weren't kidding," she said when she saw the ditch. "I passed the South Line crew on the way in. They've got heavy equipment setting up by the ridge." Ben shaded his eyes. "They said they'd stay clear of the acequia. Guess talk's cheaper than water these days." Naomi crouched to inspect the dry channel. "This'll kill half the valley if it stays closed. You've got irrigation rights, don't you?" "Had," he corrected. "Most of the neighbors sold theirs when the drought hit. I held on." She gave him a look that was equal parts frustration and admiration. "You always have to be the last one standing, huh?" "Someone's gotta be." They walked back toward the barn. The air was heavy, filled with the faint hum of machinery from the ridge. Inside, Juniper lifted her head, her dark eyes reflecting a patience that seemed older than both of them. Naomi bent to check the foals. Ember's wound was healing cleanly. Fern's fever had dropped. Echo's heart, though still fragile, beat stronger beneath her stethoscope. "You've done good," she said. "They're pulling through." Ben watched her pack away the instruments. "Doesn't feel like enough." "It never does." She gave him a long look. "But it's how you start." After she left, he walked the property line, tracing the fence with his gloved hand. The land stretched out in muted colors: ochre, rust, gray-green sage. A hawk circled high above the arroyo, its shadow gliding along the ground like a living scar. That evening, he drove his old Ford down the rutted road toward town. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in copper and violet. Dust followed him like a ghost. When he reached the crossroads, he could see the heavy trucks at the South Line site, lights burning even as the day died. Men in hard hats moved through the glow, setting stakes, hammering steel. He pulled over, engine idling, and stepped out. "Can I help you?" a man shouted from behind the fence. Ben rested his arms on the rail. "Just making sure you boys know what land you're digging into." The man shrugged. "Company's got the permits. Nothing here but dirt anyway." "Dirt's what keeps everything alive out here," Ben said. The worker laughed, shook his head, and turned away. Ben stayed until the last echo of the hammering faded. Then he climbed back into his truck and headed home under a sky thick with starlight. When he returned, the ranch lay silent, except for the soft rustle of animals breathing. He stepped into the barn and found Juniper waiting. The foals slept in a heap, limbs tangled, the faint rise and fall of their chests, like the rhythm of a distant tide. He brushed a hand down Juniper's neck. "They're saying this land's finished," he murmured. "Guess they've never watched something try to live through a storm." He sank onto the hay bale, exhaustion sinking deeper than muscle. Outside, the night wind whispered across the dry fields, carrying the ghost of flowing water. He thought about the acequia, about the story Tomas had told, the ghost run herd that brought rain back to dying ground. "Maybe you were right, old man," he said to the darkness. "Maybe the land's waiting on them again." A faint sound broke the stillness, a soft whicker. Echo, half awake, had lifted his head, eyes gleaming in the lamplight. For a second, Ben could swear the colt was looking past him, toward the open door, toward the barren horizon where no water moved. Ben stood and walked to the threshold. The wind carried dust across the yard, tracing patterns in the moonlight. Somewhere far away, thunder flickered, so faint he could almost pretend it wasn't there. He smiled, not quite sure why. "You hear that, little one?" he whispered. "Still a chance yet." He closed the barn doors and let the night wrap around him. In his bones, he could feel the weight of something shifting, the calm before whatever came next. The land was holding its breath, and so was he. The wind came early that evening, sliding down from the mountains like a warning. It started with a dry whisper through the sagebrush, then built until the tin roof of the barn trembled in its rafters. Ben stood outside, staring west where clouds had piled up like bruises against the horizon. The scent of dust was sharp and bitter, and the light had turned the color of old copper. He'd seen storms like this before, ones that didn't bring rain, just chaos. Juniper pawed the ground, uneasy. She'd been restless all day, tossing her head, pacing the fence line. "I know," Ben said, tightening her halter. "We'll ride it out." But the reassurance was for himself, more than her. Inside, the foals were agitated. Ember kicked at the stall wall, eager for movement. Fern snorted, trembling, her ears twitching at every groan of the wind. Echo lay still, but his breathing came shallow, labored, the same rhythm Ben had learned to fear. The pressure in the air shifted. A dust devil whirled across the yard, scattering straw and grit against the door. Ben latched the barn tight, securing feed sacks along the lower boards. The sound of the wind was no longer a whisper. It was a voice, guttural and low, roaring through the gaps in the walls. He poured water into the tin basin, though he knew most would spill before the night was through. As darkness fell, the storm hit full. The sky fractured with dry lightning, the air flickering white for half-seconds that felt endless. Juniper stamped, tossing her mane, her eyes catching every flash. The foals huddled together. Ben moved between them, checking their blankets, murmuring nonsense words just to keep himself steady. Then came the noise he dreaded most, the low wheeze from Echo's chest. He knelt instantly, pressing a hand to the colt's flank. Heat radiated from his skin. "Not tonight," Ben whispered. "Don't you quit on me." The colt shivered violently, sides heaving. Fern whickered a thin, frightened note, as if pleading for him to fix it. Ben tore his coat off, wrapped it around Echo's body, and began rubbing, steady, rhythmic. "Breathe, little one." The words came rough, more prayer than command. Juniper leaned close, her muzzle brushing Echo's head. Her breath washed warm across the colt's face. The sound of her slow exhale seemed to sync with his. For long minutes, that was all there was. Wind screaming outside, thunder cracking somewhere in the distance, and the quiet rhythm of a man and his mare trying to keep death from crossing the threshold. Ben's shoulders ached, but he didn't stop. He could feel the tremor under his palms ease a fraction. Echo coughed, once, twice, then took a deeper breath. It wasn't steady, but it was life. Ben exhaled hard, forehead dropping against the foal's damp neck. "There you go," he whispered. "Stay with me." Juniper turned her head toward the storm, ears pricked. Another sound joined the wind then. A low, distant howl that didn't belong to thunder. Coyotes, maybe. Or wolves. Whatever it was, it carried hunger in it. The mare snorted, her muscles tensing. Ben rose slowly, grabbing the shotgun from the wall. He didn't load it. The sound alone would be enough to warn off scavengers if they drew near. He stood by the door, listening. The wind pressed against the boards, breathing in and out like a living thing. He thought of the acequia, of Southline's dry trenches slicing into the valley, stealing the only pulse of water left. The land was fighting back tonight, but it was fighting through fury, not grace. Hours passed that way, half darkness, half lightning. The barn groaned, the world outside vanished into a wall of noise. Inside, he checked on the foals again and again. Ember had curled around Fern, protecting her with his small frame. Echo slept fitfully, but breathed deeper now. Ben brushed a hand along Juniper's neck. "You did good, girl." At some point near midnight, the wind began to die. The air thinned, and the silence afterward was heavier than the storm had been. Ben eased the door open a crack. The yard was a ruin of straw and dust, the sky stripped clean of clouds. Moonlight spilled across the valley, pale and unsteady. Behind him, a weak nicker sounded. Echo was awake, eyes open, mismatched colors glinting in the dim light. He struggled once, then managed to lift his head. Ben crouched beside him again. "Still with me?" The colt's breath rasped, but didn't break. He turned his head slightly, nose bumping against Ben's hand. For a moment, something passed between them, something wordless, older than the both of them. Ben sat there until the first hint of dawn painted the edges of the hills in gray. The barn smelled of sweat, straw, and survival. The foals slept. Juniper dozed standing, head low, tail swaying like a slow pendulum. When the sun finally broke through, Ben stepped outside. The storm had scoured the sky clear, revealing a world washed raw. The acequia glinted faintly in the distance, catching what little dew the wind had left. It wasn't running water, but it was something. He tilted his face to the light, feeling it burn the cold from his skin. The night had left him drained, but beneath the exhaustion, something else stirred. A quiet certainty. He'd held back the dark one more time. Inside, Echo gave a soft, cracked whinny that rose, quivered, and faded. Ben smiled faintly. "You're learning to fight," he said. Juniper flicked an ear, as if she agreed. The valley was still, but in its stillness there was promise, the kind of silence that comes after the worst has passed, when the world pauses just long enough to decide whether it will begin again. The storm left the land bruised but alive. By sunrise, the fields shimmered under a thin crust of frost, each blade of grass edged with light. Smoke rose from the stovepipe of Ben's house, thin, hesitant. Inside the barn, warmth returned in the form of a small miracle. Ember was standing steady now, Fern was nibbling at a flake of hay, and Echo, though weak, managed to roll onto his side without help. The night's terror had passed, leaving behind a fragile kind of peace. Ben stoked the iron stove he'd dragged from the shed that morning, the metal groaning as it took the flame. He hadn't used it in years. It still smelled of oil and rust, but soon the barn filled with the deep hum of heat. Juniper stood near it, her body casting a long, calm shadow over the Foals. The air no longer smelled of fear. It smelled of smoke, hay, and the faint sweetness of milk, like the world had started over again. When Naomi arrived just before noon, her truck tires hissed over frozen mud. She stepped out, blinking against the light. "I heard about the wind event," she said. "I figured you might need help." "We made it," Ben replied simply. His voice was rough from the long night. Naomi crouched to check Echo's breathing. "And this one?" "Still here." She smiled faintly. "He's tougher than he looks." "He had help." Ben nodded toward Juniper, who lowered her head as if accepting the praise. Naomi glanced around the barn, taking in the patched roof, the old stove glowing in the corner, the way the Foals had started to doze in the straw. "You've turned this place into a sanctuary," she said. Ben shook his head. "Just keeping things alive, that's all." "You'd be surprised how rare that is," she replied softly. They spent the afternoon reinforcing the barn door, hammering fresh planks where the storm had torn the hinges loose. Each blow of the hammer rang out like punctuation in the silence. Outside, the mountains shimmered under a pale sky, their tops dusted with new snow. As they worked, a dust-covered pickup rolled into the yard. Two men climbed out, neighbors from down the road, one carrying a sack of feed, the other a coil of wire. "Heard you could use a hand," the older man said. "And maybe a little hay. The storm scattered half our fence. Figured we'd rebuild together." Ben blinked, taken aback. "Didn't think word traveled that fast." The younger one grinned. "In a valley this small, good deeds echo louder than gunfire." Naomi chuckled under her breath. "You're officially famous, Mercer." They worked until the light slanted gold. The sound of nails, laughter, and the occasional curse filled the air. Someone found an old coffee tin and brewed it over the stove. When dusk came, the barn looked different, solid again, warmer somehow. The community that had forgotten how to gather had found its reason. Ember whickered softly, drawing everyone's attention. He'd managed to balance on all fours for the first time without wobbling. A cheer went up, low and sincere. Fern lifted her head, curious. Even Echo stirred, his mismatched eyes catching the firelight. Ben stood by the stove, quiet amid the noise. He hadn't realized until then how much he'd missed the sound of people. Years of silence had hollowed him out, but tonight, voices filled the empty corners. It didn't feel crowded. It felt right. Naomi came to stand beside him, wiping her hands on her jeans. "You know," she said, "they don't just come for the horses. They come because you remind them what decency looks like." Ben's jaw tightened. "I'm no example." "Maybe not, but you didn't quit. That counts for something." He looked at her, then at the group clustered around the Foals, their faces glowing in the orange light. "Didn't figure I'd ever see this place like that again," he admitted. She smiled. "You gave it permission to breathe." Later, when the neighbors left, the barn settled into quiet again. The stove ticked as it cooled, and outside the stars returned, bright and sharp against the black sky. Juniper nudged Ben's shoulder, her breath a soft cloud in the cold. He rested his hand on her neck. "Guess they're not the only ones that needed saving," he murmured. He sat beside the stove, the old wood creaking beneath him, and watched the Foals sleep. Ember's head rested across Fern's neck. Echo lay nearest to the warmth, his breathing steady now. Ben felt something shift in him, a faint thawing where grief had long been frozen. He thought of the flood, of the night he'd lost everything, and realized the ache no longer cut the same. The memory still hurt, but it no longer hollowed him. These small creatures, against all odds, had stitched something back together. Juniper sighed and folded her legs beneath her, lying down beside the foals. The sight drew a slow smile from him. He pulled the old wool blanket tighter around his shoulders and leaned back. The sound of breathing, horse, man, and fire, blended into one rhythm. Outside, frost began to bloom across the ground again, sparkling beneath the moonlight. But inside the barn, warmth pulsed steady and sure. Ben's last thought before sleep took him was simple, almost childlike. The world isn't done with me yet. When dawn came, a faint glow spilled through the slats, brushing the straw with silver. Echo lifted his head first, blinking at the light. Then Fern, then Ember. Juniper rose slow and graceful. Ben opened his eyes to the sound of their movement and smiled. For the first time in years, the morning didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like a beginning. The next week began with a silence too clean to trust. The wind had gone still, the sky a sheer sheet of pale blue without a cloud to speak of. The mountains crouched on the horizon like sleeping giants, and every sound, the creak of a gate, the click of a hoof, the brush of straw, seemed magnified against the emptiness. Ben felt the change before he understood it. Something in the land was waiting. The acequia lay like a scar, cracked and useless, but when he walked past it that morning, he caught the faintest scent of moisture. Not rain, not yet, but something. Inside the barn, the foals were restless again. Ember had grown bold, his chestnut coat now bright with sheen. He kicked at the stall, eager for open ground. Fern, delicate but sturdy, followed his every move. Echo was slower, thoughtful, watching before acting. The gray colt had taken to standing near Juniper, shadowing her steps as if learning from her calm. Ben poured fresh water into the trough, speaking quietly as he worked. "You'll run again one day," he said, mostly to himself, "when this ground remembers what it means to live." That afternoon, Thomas Begay came by, carrying a roll of brittle maps. His old truck rattled like bones. "You still believe in fixing what's broken?" he asked, without preamble. Ben wiped his hands on his jeans. "Depends what you mean." Thomas spread the maps across a feed barrel. "These are the old acequia routes," he said, "from before the county redrew the water lines. The ghosts of every stream that once ran through this valley." He tapped a finger against the yellowed paper. "See this bend? That's where your creek should have met the arroyo. If we rebuild the diversion here, water could find its way back." Ben studied the lines. "You're talking about handwork, digging stone by stone." "Exactly." He looked up, skeptical but intrigued. "That's a month of labor for what? A trickle?" Thomas smiled, slow and knowing. "A trickle's how rivers start." Before Ben could answer, Naomi's truck pulled in. She stepped out with a camera slung over her shoulder. "Hope you boys don't mind company. Maya asked me to film something for her podcast about the Acequia Project." "Maya?" Ben asked. "The reporter from the diner," Naomi said. "Apparently people liked her first piece about the foals. She's calling this one When Water Remembers." Ben sighed. Guess privacy's not what it used to be. Naomi shrugged. Sometimes the land needs witnesses. They spent the rest of the afternoon walking the dry channel. Tomas showed them where the silt had built up, where stones could be repositioned to catch runoff. Naomi measured elevation angles while Ben cleared debris with a shovel. The work was slow, rhythmic, like a prayer said with hands instead of words. As the sun began to dip, Ben paused to rest. His shirt clung with sweat. Dust caked the creases of his palms. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel tired. He felt connected, as if every muscle had found its purpose again. He glanced at Juniper and the foals watching from the fence line. The mare's ears twitched toward him, then toward the horizon. The wind had picked up. Light at first, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of change. Tomas noticed it too. "Hear that?" he said quietly. "That's how it begins." By twilight, the work had carved a narrow path through the dirt. It wasn't much, just a shallow trench lined with rocks, but when Ben poured the last of his stored water into it, the flow held, sluggish, stubborn, alive. Naomi crouched beside him, camera forgotten. "Look at that," she said. "It's moving." Ben watched the tiny stream twist along the trench, catching the reflection of the dying sun. "Yeah," he said softly. "It's remembering." They stayed there until the sky turned indigo. Crickets began to sing, and the smell of the earth changed again, richer now, looser, as if it had unclenched its fist. When they finally walked back to the barn, night was settling in. The foals stirred, their ears pricking at the sound of water trickling faintly through the ditch outside. Ember stamped once, Fern whickered softly, and Echo lifted his head, eyes shining two different colors in the lamplight. Juniper stepped forward and pressed her muzzle to Ben's chest. The gesture stopped him cold. He rested a hand against her neck. "You feel it too," he murmured. "Something's coming." Outside, the first stars broke through. Ben stood by the barn door, watching them tremble against the dark. His body ached, but it was the good kind of ache, the kind that comes from creation, not loss. He thought of the valley, the dry riverbeds, the broken fences, the people who had given up, and realized what had changed wasn't the land. It was him. The stillness inside him had started to flow again, trickling like the water he'd just set free. Naomi's voice came from behind him, soft but sure. "You know, most people build fences to keep things out. You seem to be building a road back in." Ben didn't turn. "Maybe it's time the world had a way home." Juniper blew through her nostrils, and in the faint distance, a sound followed. A low, echoing whinny that didn't belong to any horse on the ranch. Faint, carried on the wind, but there. Tomas froze, eyes wide. "You hear that?" Naomi nodded slowly. "Was that?" Ben's pulse jumped. He listened again, but the wind had already swallowed it. Still the feeling lingered. Somewhere out there, beyond the ridge, something had answered. He smiled, not with triumph, but with quiet awe. Maybe the ghosts are finally awake. That night, long after the others had gone, he sat outside with Juniper and watched the stars wheel across the sky. From the acequia came a faint trickle of sound, like a heartbeat returning after a long sleep. In the barn, the foals shifted, dreaming. And somewhere in the darkness beyond, a horse's voice rose once more, low, steady, calling toward the water. The day it happened began like any other, bright, windless, the valley wrapped in the soft quiet that comes before spring. The snow on the far ridges had started to melt, feeding a faint murmur through the channels Ben and Tomas had rebuilt. For weeks, the acequia had carried nothing but a trickle. Now it ran with a confidence that seemed almost human. Ben stood at its edge that morning, coffee in hand, watching sunlight fracture across the moving water. The sound was steady, delicate, full of promise. Juniper grazed nearby, her coat shining under the new warmth. Behind her, the foals, Ember, Fern, and Echo, moved with a liveliness that still amazed him. They were filling out, legs no longer trembling under their weight. Even Echo, once frail and unsure, had begun to trot clumsily, his mismatched eyes alert and bright. Naomi's truck pulled up the drive. She stepped out with her hair whipped by the breeze and a grin that didn't try to hide the tiredness beneath. "You've got water running," she said, nodding toward the ditch. "I could hear it from the road." "First time in 3 years," Ben said. "Guess Tomas knew what he was doing." "Tomas knows what the land remembers," she replied. "The rest of us just try to listen." She joined him by the ditch. "You ever wonder why you found those foals in that arroyo?" "All the time." "Maybe it wasn't just chance," she said. "Maybe they were waiting for you to do this." Ben didn't answer. He'd thought the same thing more than once, but couldn't bring himself to name it out loud. Saying it would make it fragile, like holding water in bare hands. They walked back to the barn together. The smell of hay mixed with wet earth and new grass. Juniper lifted her head as they approached, and the foals came running, or something close to it. Ember in front, bold as ever, Fern behind, graceful, cautious, and Echo trailing, moving slower but with a steady rhythm that made Ben smile. "They're almost ready for the pasture," Naomi said. "Almost," Ben agreed. "Another week, maybe 2. Naomi leaned on the gate, watching the 3 of them. "It's strange," she said. "They're not wild, but they're not tame either. They belong to something in between." "Same could be said about me," Ben said. She smiled at that, but before she could reply, a sound carried across the valley, a long, rolling whinny that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Juniper's head shot up, ears forward, nostrils flaring. The foals froze, their bodies electric. Ben felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. "You hear that?" Naomi's eyes widened. "It's coming from the ridge." They turned toward the west, toward the hills where the acequia disappeared into the wild scrub. The call came again, this time sharper, layered with others, dozens of voices answering each other. Then movement, shapes cresting the ridge, dark against the pale sky. Horses. The herd came slow at first, single file, cautious. Their manes caught the sun, their coats streaked with dust. There were 12, maybe more, led by a massive black stallion whose muscles rippled like thunderclouds. They descended the hill in silence except for the rhythm of hooves hitting dry earth. Ben and Naomi stood speechless. Juniper's ears flicked, her breath coming fast. The foals pressed against her side, uncertain but curious. When the herd reached the field, the stallion halted. He lifted his head high, scanning the land, nostrils flaring, his eyes locked on the small group by the barn. The air between them felt charged, ancient. Echo took a single step forward. His mismatched eyes reflected both sky and soil. He whinnied, a high, trembling sound that split the silence. The stallion answered instantly, his call deep and resonant. Ben's throat tightened. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. Naomi's camera clicked without her realizing she'd raised it. "They're communicating," she breathed. Echo took another step, then another. Juniper didn't stop him. She only watched, tail swishing, body poised, but calm. The two other foals followed hesitantly, drawn by instinct stronger than fear. When they reached the fence, the stallion lowered his head until his muzzle nearly touched Echo's across the boards. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the stallion exhaled, a deep, rumbling breath that stirred dust from the ground. The herd behind him shifted, forming a semicircle, protective, expectant. Tomas's voice carried from behind them, startling Ben. "Ghost run," he said quietly. He had arrived unnoticed, leaning on his old cane. "I told you they'd come when the water returned." Ben turned, half laughing, half shaking his head. "You were serious about that legend." Tomas nodded toward the stallion. "That one's blood remembers every path ever cut by rain. They came to see if the land was worth believing in again." Naomi lowered her camera. "And is it?" Tomas smiled. "Ask them." As if on cue, the black stallion whinnied again, softer this time. Ember responded with a clumsy echo, Fern with a hesitant snort. Echo stayed silent, but didn't back away. His body was still thin, his movements uncertain, yet he stood his ground. Ben unlatched the gate without fully knowing why. The hinges creaked, the sound swallowed by the wind. The herd didn't move at first. Then, slowly, the stallion stepped forward, crossing into the yard. Dust lifted around his hooves like smoke. Juniper moved to meet him, ears forward, unafraid. They circled each other once, twice, neither aggressive nor submissive, just acknowledging. The stallion nickered low in his throat. Juniper exhaled through her nose, then turned toward Ben, eyes calm. He understood. It wasn't goodbye. It was trust. He backed away, giving them space. Echo followed Juniper's lead, pressing close to the black stallion. The herd seemed to close around him, the formation instinctive, seamless. For the first time, Echo looked complete, like he had stepped into the story that had been waiting for him all along. Naomi whispered, "It's beautiful." Ben nodded, words caught in his throat. He wanted to stop them, to hold on to what he'd saved, but he knew better. Life was movement, not possession. The stallion turned once more toward Ben, as if in recognition, then tossed his head and started toward the open plain. The herd followed, Juniper and the foals at its center. Their hooves pounded against the soft earth, each beat sinking with the rush of water from the acequia, the valley's twin heartbeat. Dust rose behind them, glowing gold in the fading sun. Ben stood until they became silhouettes on the horizon, until the sound of their passage merged with the whisper of running water. Naomi touched his arm gently. "You okay?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah. Just trying to remember what it feels like when something ends the right way." Tomas chuckled softly behind them. "It doesn't end, friend. It just changes shape." As the last of the herd vanished into the twilight, the land fell silent again, but it wasn't the hollow silence of before. It was full, alive, like a pause between heartbeats. Ben looked at the acequia one last time. The water shimmered under the moonrise, carrying reflections of sky and earth. It ran steady now, unstoppable. He whispered, "Thank you," though he wasn't sure to whom. The wind answered anyway, gentle and sure, carrying the faint echo of hooves long gone. The day after the herd's arrival, the valley carried a strange calm, like a wound that had begun to knit. The sky was clean, the kind of blue that only follows a storm of meaning. Ben sat on the porch with a mug of coffee gone cold, watching the acequia shimmer through the fields. The water moved slow and sure, whispering against the rocks he and Tomas had laid by hand. Juniper grazed nearby, her coat catching the light. The foals had followed the herd into the high plain at dawn, though Ben had watched Echo hesitate before crossing the ridge. The colt had looked back once, mismatched eyes glinting, and then disappeared into the horizon. That image stayed with Ben, lingering like the last note of a song that refused to end. A truck engine broke the quiet. Dust rose from the road as Sheriff Rosa Delgado pulled in, boots crunching against the gravel. She looked tired, her badge dulled by dust. "Morning, Mercer," she said. "You've got company coming." He frowned. "That's so?" "Southline Aggregates. They're filing a complaint." Ben's stomach tightened. "About what?" "Water rights. Seems your little acequia project is redirecting flow from their property. They're claiming damages." He laughed dryly. "Funny. Didn't see much water running through their land before." "Doesn't matter. They've got lawyers, and lawyers don't need rain to make trouble." She studied him for a moment. "You did something good here, Ben. Don't let them take it apart with paperwork." Before he could answer, another truck appeared, a gleaming black pickup with Southline's logo on the door. Two men climbed out, their boots too clean for real work. The taller one, a regional manager named Cole Harmon, wore mirrored sunglasses and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Mercer," he said smoothly, "we need to talk." Ben crossed his arms. "I'm listening." "We've reviewed your so-called restoration. It's diverting runoff that belongs to our mining lease. We'll need you to dismantle it." "The acequia's been here 100 years," Ben replied. "Your company's been here what, 6 months?" Harmon chuckled. "Be reasonable. We've got permits. You don't." Rosa stepped forward, her tone calm but firm. "Actually, he does. County heritage laws protect historical waterways. The records just needed updating, which I've already filed." Harmon's smile faltered. "Sheriff, I hope you understand who you're siding with here." "I'm siding with whoever's keeping this valley alive," she said. The tension stretched like a rope ready to snap. Ben felt the weight of it in his chest but said nothing. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the field, tugging at the man's pressed suit jacket. "Fine," Harmon said finally, turning toward his truck. "But don't think this is over." As the company vehicle disappeared down the road, Rosa exhaled. "You just made enemies with deep pockets, Mercer." "Wouldn't be the first time," he said. She smiled faintly. "Just make sure it's worth it." That afternoon, Naomi arrived, her camera slung across her shoulder. "Maya's episode dropped this morning," she said. "The farmer who brought the water back. It's already trending." Ben groaned. "Great, more attention." "Good attention," Naomi corrected. "People are donating to a conservation fund. We might have enough to buy back part of the ridge and turn it into a protected corridor for the Mustangs." He blinked. "You serious?" She nodded. "If the herd returns, they'll have somewhere safe to stay." Ben looked toward the horizon, where the ridge cut the sky like a heartbeat line. "They will," he said quietly. "They always do." Later, when the sun had begun to fall, Tomas drove up with the back of his truck loaded with saplings, cottonwoods, willows, young and thin as dreams. "Thought we could give the water some company," he said. They planted in silence, 3 figures moving like clock hands through the fading light. Naomi dug, Tomas steadied the roots, and Ben filled the holes. The air was soft, carrying the smell of wet earth and growing things. When they finished, a line of trees traced the acequia's edge, their leaves trembling with the first real wind of evening. Tomas leaned on his shovel. "You ever notice," he said, "how nobody really owns land? We just borrow it from the wind." Ben wiped sweat from his brow. "Then I hope the wind doesn't charge rent." Tomas chuckled. "It already does. Makes us work for peace." Naomi smiled, tucking her hair behind her ear. "Maybe that's the point." The sun slipped behind the mesa, turning the water gold. They stood together, watching the reflection ripple, a moment suspended between labor and rest. The valley, once silent, now hummed softly with the sound of life returning. When Naomi left, Ben stayed behind. The new trees whispered in the dusk, their leaves flickering like tiny tongues of flame. Juniper wandered up beside him, brushing her muzzle against his arm. Her eyes held that same quiet knowing he'd come to trust more than words. "You've seen it all now, haven't you?" he murmured. "Floods, droughts, storms, and still you stay." The mare blew softly through her nostrils, pressing closer. Beyond the ridge, lightning flickered, distant but harmless, like the pulse of a sleeping world. Ben turned toward the acequia one last time before heading in. The water caught the moonlight, running smooth, carrying the reflection of the new trees. He realized the sound it made wasn't just water. It was breath. The valley breathing again. He thought of what Tomas had said. "We just borrow it from the wind." For the first time, he felt that was enough. Spring arrived quietly, without thunder or fanfare. The snowmelt slid down from the mountains and joined the acequia's slow current, feeding it until the ditch shimmered with new strength. The cottonwoods Tomas had planted began to leaf, their tender green trembling with every sigh of breeze. The valley looked alive again. Not healed, not perfect, but breathing. Ben had learned to measure time differently now, not in days or months, but in small moments. The sound of Juniper's hooves across wet ground, the laughter of neighbors who came to check the water flow, the distant echo of coyotes singing at dusk. The ranch that once had felt like a tomb, now hummed softly with life. And yet, beneath it all, he knew a reckoning was coming. It began one morning with hoof prints by the fence, fresh, pressed deep into the damp soil. Juniper found them first, standing motionless, her ears forward. Ben followed her gaze toward the hills, where a dust trail shimmered faintly in the rising heat. The ghost-run herd had returned. By midday, the black stallion stood once again on the ridge. Behind him, the others waited, their manes rippling in the wind. They didn't descend. They only watched, as if asking permission. Juniper gave a low call in her throat, a note that carried across the distance. Inside the barn, the foals stirred. Ember, Fern, and Echo, each responding in their own way. Ember stamped, restless. Fern tilted her head, curious but hesitant. Echo stood still, the wind ruffling his silver mane. His mismatched eyes turned toward the ridge and didn't move. Ben leaned against the stall rail, a heaviness in his chest. He had known this day would come since the moment he found them dying in that arroyo. He'd promised himself he wouldn't stop them when it did. But knowing and accepting were two different things. Naomi arrived that afternoon, her camera forgotten in the truck. She took one look at the ridge and nodded. "It's time," she said quietly. "Yeah," Ben replied. "Guess it is." They opened the gate together. The creak of the hinges echoed through the valley. Juniper stepped forward first, slow and deliberate. Ember followed instantly, his stride full of restless joy. Fern hesitated at the threshold until Juniper turned back and brushed her muzzle against her neck. Then she, too, crossed into the open. Only Echo remained. He looked from Ben to the horizon, uncertain. Ben knelt in the dirt, his voice low. "You don't owe me anything, kid. You just owe yourself the sky." For a moment, the colt didn't move. Then, as if understanding, he stepped forward and pressed his muzzle into Ben's shoulder. The touch was brief, almost weightless, but it carried everything words never could. When Echo finally pulled away, Ben felt something inside him loosen. A knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for years. The herd waited until all three foals had joined them. Then the stallion turned, gave a single powerful whinny, and led them away. Dust rose around their hooves like smoke, and the sound of their movement rippled across the valley like thunder made of heartbeats. Ben stood there long after they were gone, staring at the empty space they'd left behind. Naomi stayed beside him, silent. The wind lifted her hair, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and sage. "They'll come back," she said finally. "I know," he replied, though his voice was barely a whisper. "But even if they don't, that's all right." Juniper lingered by the gate, watching until the last flicker of movement disappeared into the horizon. Then she turned toward Ben, her eyes calm. He placed a hand against her neck. "You kept your promise," he murmured. That evening, Tomas came by with a bottle of whiskey and 3 tin cups. They sat on the porch as twilight spread across the fields. The water in the acequia caught the last light, glowing like liquid gold. "Empty corrals again," Tomas said, pouring the drinks. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" "Yeah," Ben said, staring into the dusk. "But it doesn't feel wrong." They drank in silence for a while. The frogs had started their evening chorus, and a single owl called from the cottonwoods. Tomas set his cup down. "The Navajo say every creature that leaves a mark on your life becomes part of your spirit. You'll carry those 3 with you now." Ben nodded. "Maybe they carried me first." Naomi smiled faintly. "Sounds like a fair trade." As night fell, the 3 of them sat listening to the soft murmur of the acequia and the wind moving through the new leaves. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, a sound that used to make the valley feel empty. Now it sounded like belonging. When Tomas and Naomi left, Ben stayed on the porch. The stars came out one by one, scattered like seeds across the vast, dark sky. He thought about the herd crossing the plains, about Echo's mismatched eyes catching starlight. He whispered to the night, "Run free, little one." Juniper stepped from the shadows and stood beside him, her coat glinting silver under the moon. Together they watched the horizon until the first hint of dawn brushed it in gray. For the first time in years, Ben felt no weight pressing on his chest, only a wide, quiet peace. The kind that doesn't need words, only breath. The summer crept into the valley softly, with long blue mornings and evenings the color of copper dust. The acequia ran fuller now, no longer a trickle, but a silver thread stitched through the heart of the land. Where it passed, grass had begun to return, thin at first, then thick enough to wave when the wind came down from the hills. The sound of running water filled the air, steady as breath, patient as time. Ben had grown accustomed to its voice. Some nights he fell asleep listening to it from the porch, the rhythm of it mingling with Juniper's slow movements in the corral. It wasn't just water anymore. It was proof. Proof that something broken could be made whole again, even if the mending took years. He spent his mornings walking the channels, checking the stones they'd laid. The saplings Tomas had planted were taller now, leaves brushing his shoulder. Along the banks, dragonflies hovered like bits of living glass, and the scent of new earth rose heavy and sweet. When he reached the lower field one morning, he found Maya Ortiz kneeling by the ditch with a microphone and a camera crew. She looked up, smiling. "We're filming a follow-up piece," she said. "People loved your story, Ben. They're calling it The River That Stayed." He gave a quiet chuckle. "It's just a ditch." "Maybe to you," she said, "but to everyone else it's hope you can touch." Her words embarrassed him, though he couldn't deny the pride that swelled in his chest. Naomi arrived soon after, carrying medical kits and notebooks. She'd been coming less since the Foals left, but each visit brought a familiarity that made the ranch feel less empty. She checked Juniper's hooves, took samples from the new plants along the acequia, and talked with Maya about restoration grants. When they finished, Naomi stood by Ben, wiping sweat from her forehead. "You ever think about what's next?" she asked. He shrugged. Didn't know there had to be a next. The water's flowing, the land's breathing again. That's enough. She smiled gently. "You've got more in you than fixing old fences." "Maybe," he said, watching Juniper graze beneath the cottonwoods. "But this is where I finally stopped running." Later that day, Rosa drove out with county papers. "Thought you'd want to see this," she said, handing him a folder. Inside was an official declaration. Silver Arroyo Sanctuary, protected habitat and waterway. His signature was already at the bottom, scrawled from the forms Naomi had filed months earlier. "You're legal now, Mercer," Rosa said, grinning. "No one's touching this land without your say." He looked at the seal, tracing the embossed outline of the state. "Guess it's real, then." "It's as real as the dirt under your boots," she said, tipping her hat. "You earned it." That night, he lit a small fire near the water's edge. Tomas joined him, bringing an old guitar that had more cracks than strings. The old man strummed softly, humming something ancient, the notes drifting with the breeze. Juniper stood nearby, her ears twitching toward the sound. "She remembers songs," Tomas said, smiling. "Most animals do. Maybe she remembers him too." Ben nodded, knowing who he meant. Echo, Ember, Fern, and the black stallion leading them somewhere beyond sight. The thought didn't sting anymore. It settled like warmth instead of loss. "Think they'll come back?" Tomas asked. "Maybe," Ben said, "but even if they don't, I'll still hear them every time the water runs." Tomas chuckled. "That's how you know you're part of the land now. You don't wait for miracles, you listen when they speak." They fell into easy silence. Fireflies blinked over the ditch, and the stars unfolded overhead, reflected in the slow-moving water. Naomi arrived late, bringing a thermos of coffee and 3 tin cups. The 3 of them sat together, drinking and saying little. It wasn't a night for talking. It was a night for knowing. As the fire burned low, a breeze rippled across the acequia. The reflection of the stars wavered, and for an instant, Ben thought he saw movement in the distance, shapes gliding along the far ridge. He didn't stand or call out. He just watched. The forms lingered for a heartbeat, then melted into the darkness. Naomi followed his gaze. "You saw them too, didn't you?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe I did." Tomas plucked a last soft chord on his guitar, the note fading like a sigh. "Doesn't matter," he said. "They know where home is now." The fire dwindled to embers, its light tracing gentle patterns on the faces around it. The water murmured beside them, steady and alive. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain again, distant but sure. Ben leaned back, his eyes half closed, the warmth of the fire touching his skin. "Funny thing," he murmured. "Used to think peace meant forgetting. Turns out it's just remembering the right way." Naomi reached out, placing her hand briefly over his. Neither spoke. The moment didn't need words. When the fire went out, the only light came from the stars and the faint gleam of the river. The night hummed with quiet. Neither grief nor triumph. Just being. Before heading inside, Ben looked once more at the water, the trees, and the mare standing watch under the open sky. He realized then that this valley would outlive all of them, that every breath, every hoof print, every drop of water was just another line in the same story. He whispered to the wind, "Keep running," and turned toward the house. Behind him, the acequia kept its promise, singing softly to itself under the moonlight. Autumn crept back into the valley, almost without notice. The mornings were cooler now, edged with that thin sharpness that made the air smell like wood smoke and wet clay. The cottonwoods had gone gold, the acequia lined with leaves that drifted like slow coins down the water's skin. Every sunrise burned through the mist in soft, forgiving light. Ben rose earlier these days, not because of chores, but because he liked the quiet hour before the world woke. He would walk the fence line with Juniper trailing behind, her breath puffing white in the cold. The mare had grown slower, her gait a little stiffer with each dawn, but her eyes were clear. She seemed content, watchful, settled. The ranch had become a rhythm they shared. Silence, motion, stillness. He stopped one morning at the old arroyo where it had all begun, the dry creek where he'd found the foals. It wasn't dry anymore. The acequia had rejoined it months ago, and now a thin ribbon of water wound its way through, glinting under the sun. Grass and sage had crept back, stitching the scar into green. Ben crouched down, running his fingers through the current. It was cold. Clean. The ghosts that had once lived here had been washed into memory. Behind him, Juniper whinnied, low and soft. He turned, smiling. "You remember, don't you?" She flicked her ears and pawed at the dirt. For a moment, she looked toward the ridge as if expecting something, or someone. Then she lowered her head and pressed her muzzle against his shoulder. The gesture carried a quiet kind of gratitude, older than words. Later that day, Naomi arrived in her old truck. She brought news and laughter, as she always did, along with 2 boxes of seedlings. "For the ridge," she said. "We'll plant them where the herd used to pass." Together they drove up the winding trail, the truck bumping over stone and scrub. From the top, the valley unfolded beneath them, a patchwork of gold, brown, and silver water. The sanctuary marker Rosa had set gleamed near the ditch, weathered but proud. Naomi handed him a small spade. "One tree for each of them?" He nodded. "Seems right." They planted 3 saplings, one for Ember, one for Fern, and one for Echo. Naomi pressed her palms into the soil and said quietly, "There. Now they'll always have roots here." Ben stood back, breathing in the scent of the fresh-turned earth. A gust of wind rolled through, rattling the leaves. For a heartbeat, it almost sounded like hooves pounding far away, fading toward the horizon. He looked west, but there was nothing. Only the shifting light, the movement of grass bending with the wind's invisible hand. When they drove back down, the sun was sinking, the sky washed in pink and violet. Naomi reached over, resting her hand lightly on his arm. "You know," she said, "you could leave this place now. Travel. Start again somewhere else." Ben smiled faintly. "I already did." That evening, after Naomi had gone, he sat by the water's edge, listening. Crickets sang, the frogs joined them, and somewhere a lone coyote called. The sound didn't bring loneliness anymore. It felt like company. The moon rose full and clear. Juniper stood by the barn, her coat pale in the silver light. She turned her head toward him and gave a low, drawn-out whinny. Soft, almost a hum. It rolled across the field and into the trees. The kind of sound that said everything was all right. Ben closed his eyes, hearing the memory of others answering her. Echo's young call, Ember's fiery impatience, Fern's shy response. For a moment, the valley was alive with them again, their voices overlapping with the whisper of the acequia, the breath of the wind, the pulse of the land itself. Then the sound faded, leaving only the steady murmur of water. He rose and walked to Juniper, laying a hand against her neck. Her body was warm beneath the chill air. "You did good, girl," he whispered. "We both did." She leaned her weight against him, heavy and solid, and for a long while they stood like that, 2 silhouettes caught in the moonlight, the ranch around them quiet and eternal. When the dawn came, pale and gold, Ben found her lying peacefully by the fence, eyes closed, breath gone. She looked as if she'd simply decided to rest and never woke. He didn't cry at first. He just knelt beside her, hand resting on her muzzle, and let the silence speak. The sun climbed slow, the light spreading across the fields like forgiveness. Later, he buried her near the acequia, where the water ran brightest. Tomas and Naomi helped, neither speaking much. When they finished, Naomi placed a flat river stone on the mound. "She was part of the ghost run too," she said. Ben nodded. "Maybe she was the last of it. Or maybe she was the beginning," Tomas murmured. That evening, Ben sat alone on the porch, the smell of rain in the air. The first drops fell just after sunset, tapping the tin roof with soft insistence. The acequia swelled, running faster, the sound deep and sure. And then, faintly, from somewhere far off in the valley, came a single whinny, clear, echoing through the storm. Ben froze. He knew that sound. It was unmistakable. He smiled, closing his eyes as the rain grew heavier. "Run free," he whispered into the dark. When he opened his eyes again, the sky had split into 1,000 shades of silver, and the acequia shimmered like a living ribbon under the lightning. Somewhere beyond the ridge, he imagined the herd running. Echo in the lead, Juniper beside him, manes flying, hooves drumming a song only the wind could carry. The rain poured harder, washing the dust from the earth, filling every hollow and hollowed heart. The valley shone, alive again. Ben sat until the fireflies returned. Tiny stars over a land reborn. He felt the ache of loss, yes, but threaded through it was gratitude so vast it hurt. For the first time in his life, the sound of water made him smile. If this story touched something deep in you, if it reminded you that kindness can still bring miracles, just drop a simple one in the comments. That's enough for me to know you were here, and that you felt it too. And if you want to keep walking with me through more stories like this, stories of people, horses, and the small moments that heal the world, hit subscribe and stay with us. Because the next story might be the one that finds you.